我们向大家介绍一下第四段的这个主要内容。哈德森教授在第四段谈论的是如何避免美国的金融病。他强调应该向古典政治经济学学习，这一点呢和我们现在国内的经济学主流基本上把政治经济学放弃，而全面转向新古典主义的西方这个经济学这个是正好两个方向。所以这个提议呢，哈德森教授这个提议是很及时也是很重要的。那他认为中国真正可以向美国学习的唯一方法就是学习他在19世纪是如何富强的。
All this poses the question, what kind of economic theory can explain what problems that you should avoid and not to suffer that are plaguing the United States and European economies? How do you avoid the kind of poverty that you're having in the United States and the debt deflation, the fact that almost all, if income goes up for American wage earners, all their income is paid to the bankers for housing, for their credit card companies, for medical insurance. It's not paid for goods and services. It's paid for the rent extracting class. Well, obviously, China needs a financial system. And obviously it needs homes of its own. The question is, how do you avoid organizing your real estate and your industry in the way that the United States? And fortunately, there is a theory to explain this problem. And that's what 19th century classical political economy was all about. It's how to prevent landlords from dominating society, how to prevent the banks and creditors from enriching themselves at the rest of the economy. So, and it was out of this classical economics that Marxism evolved. And Marxism became the capstone of British political economy. He pushed classical economics of Adam Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill to its logical conclusion. Because he said, you know, just like the landowners, hereditary landlords exploit rent payers, the employers exploit labor. Their idea is to pay labor as little as possible and sell the product it makes for a profit, as much of a markup as it can get. That's their profit. And capitalism is exploitive too. And the question is, do you want an exploitative society or do you want to minimize exploitation? And Marx said, ultimately, capitalism is revolutionary. Right now, people say Marx is a revolutionist, but what made Marx a revolutionist was he said capitalism is revolutionary because the industrial capitalists of Europe said, if we wanted England to compete, we cannot have protective tariffs to protect agricultural rents. We cannot let the landlord class just take all the economic surplus. We want the surplus to be spent on labor and industry. And that meant that you had to change politics. In the whole of 19th century, in every country, England, Germany, England had the House of Lords, and it had the Parliament. There were two houses of government. And the House of Lords was the upper house. And you had to one of your ancestors had to come and murder and grab the land of Englishmen, push them off the land, and do to Englishmen what Americans did to the American Indians. You had to grab their land and then make everybody else pay rent. And they could block anything that the House of Commons could do. So there was the whole fight. The first fight occurred in 1846 when the House of Commons said, we're not going to protect landlord rents anymore in agriculture. We're going to have free trade and we're going to abolish the Corn Laws. And the final great fight was a constitutional crisis in England from 1909 to 1910. When the Commons said, we're going to have a land tax. We're going to end the House of Lords. We're going to take away all their hereditary rents. We're going to get rid of them. That's going to be the taxes. They're going to have to actually go to work for a living now for the first time in 1,000 years. And the House of Lords naturally vetoed the bill. There was a crisis, and in 1910, the English system was revised so that the House of Lords no longer could revoke a revenue bill passed by the House of Commons. By that time, unfortunately, England was already moving towards war, and it never did have a land tax. But the landlord succeeded in preventing England from collecting any statistics on land values. The United States had very excellent statistics on land values. So does Japan. So in the United States, they were able to move much more towards land taxation. And there was a great movement towards that. And there was a movement towards anti-monopoly regulation under Theodore Roosevelt. The interesting thing is that all of this fight against landlords, the fight against corrupt bankers, the fight against monopolists was led by the business class. And the theory of this was taught in the business schools. And the business schools were founded after the Civil War ended in the United States in 1865. Here's the problem that the industrial class had in the United States. All of the textbooks they had were written by British free traders. The universities in America were basically founded, as they were in Europe, to train members of the clergy, to train religious leaders. And it was all moral philosophy, and they picked up all of the free trade doctrines that England was promoting. And the industrialists said, look, we can't have free trade and anti-socialism here because we have to have universities teach how we're actually going to develop a strong government to lead in American industrialization. And so they said, well, we can't go to the religious universities like Harvard and Yale because you can't restructure somebody's mind that's already tunnel vision. So they created a whole new set of universities. They created land-grant state universities to teach protectionist economics and economics of strong government. And they created business schools to create how business will get rich by having a public infrastructure as a means of production. But the objective of public infrastructure is to, and this was what the Wharton School of Economics taught in the United States, the first business school. The first economics professor, Simon Patton, was a protectionist, and he said the role of public infrastructure investment isn't to make a profit like private ownership. The purpose of private investment in infrastructure is to lower the price of education, lower the price of roads, lower the price of getting health care, lower the prices that the economy needs for its basic needs so that it can function at a low price so that our industrialists can afford to undersell other countries. That's how America got rich. And that's exactly what China is doing today. But it's exactly what's not taught in the textbook. So the only way that China can actually learn from the United States is to learn how it got rich in the 19th century and to learn how England and Germany and Europe got rich. And that's to discuss essentially value, price, and rent theory. And to focus not so much on exchange but and income, but on wealth. And if you look at wealth, stocks, bonds, housing, assets, wealth is much larger than income, and it's distributed much more unequally. I think 1% of Americans own about 60% of the stock market. So this is much more than 60% of the income. But if you can control the wealth, then you can control the system of who gets the income of debt and credit. And essentially, you end up with a centralized economy. So you end up with the wealth economy being something independent of the real economy of production and consumption. And Marx discussed this in volume 3 of Capital, where he discusses finance. And he says, money and debt and credit grow by purely mathematical laws. There was interest-bearing debt already in 2500 BC, long before there was industrial capitalism. There was debt throughout Greece and Rome. That's what essentially bankrupted antiquity. The debt grows by the mathematics of compound interest that are independent of the ability to pay. So the first thing to recognize is that the economy is wrapped in a kind of surrounding shell of debt that extracts income from it in the form of debt service. Think of it as a parasite extracting from the host. And the parasite is extracting more, but the parasite is growing much faster than the host. And at a certain point, it extracts so much revenue, so much life from the industrial economy that there's a crash. And that was Marx's theories of crises in the 19th century. I think that most Marxists today, certainly in the United States, I don't know about China, focus on volume 1 of Capital, where Marx talks about what he said that was his addition to classical economics, where he's talking about the employers, the industrialists' exploitation of wage labor, selling its products at a markup. But Marx did that because he thought that the other economists before him had already solved the problem of rent. Marx thought that capitalism was going to evolve into socialism once it had got rid of feudalism, once it had got rid of the landlord class, once it had got rid of the predatory banking class and industrialized banking, once it had developed government public ownership. And all of this, he said, was leading, paving the way to socialism, to simply take over when it took over at the point when it decided that it wanted the whole economy to grow together instead of just concentrating all of the wealth at the top of the economic pyramid in the wealthiest 1% of the economy. So the classical idea of a free market was one free from economic rent, not free for landlords, monopolists, and creditors. The whole idea of a free market to classical economics is the opposite of what the monopolists and propagandists call a free market today. And they can only get away with this turning the language upside down by not teaching the history of economic thought, by not teaching economic history. So the one thing that I want to do in these lectures to China is to review and revive this economic history and the kind of economic thought that was developed then. And as I said, it was developed largely by the conservatives in Britain. The conservative prime minister, Benjamin Disraeli, was the prime minister from 1874 to 1880. And he said, the health of a people is really the foundation upon which all their happiness and all their power as a state depend. And so he developed what became the national health system of Britain. The idea that you want to keep the labor force and the population healthy because it's very expensive to get sick and you miss work and you still have to pay. Well, right now, Donald Trump and the Americans are the opposite. The sickness of the people is the way that the health insurance industry and the drug makers can get rich. So that's the opposite philosophy. Do you want the health makers to get rich, or do you want the people to be healthy? If you make healthcare take 18% of America's GDP, imagine what if China had to pay as much for its healthcare as the United States does. It wouldn't have any money to industrialize. All the money would go to the pharmaceuticals companies. Just as in the United States, if the workers have to pay so much for healthcare, so much for health insurance, so much for housing, how on earth can they compete with China? And that's what makes the conflict internationally today so different from just a conflict between two industrial countries. It's between industrialized China and a financialized, deindustrialized United States. So in the second part of this lecture, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to talk about how finance capitalism promotes rent-seeking and opposes taxes, and how finance capitalism destroys industry and industrial capitalism.
我们在以前几个不同段落中介绍的时候也讲过，美国是直到这个南北战争完成，为美国的产业资本找到了自己本国的原材料市场，并且构建了美国自己的这个产业在国内的消费市场，然后进一步又极度扩大了美国的国土面积，因为他把西班牙打败之后，就意味着把墨西哥的大量的领土收入美国的版图，这时候它变成世界上的版图相对排在第几啊？我印象里应该排在第3大的国家，那他才开始以殖民主义的手段，向亚洲做侵略扩张，这时候他才要求门户开放，他才走向所谓的自由主义，在以前他是保守主义的，或者甚至是闭关锁国的。好了，我们说他是用这种方式，以政府保护本国产业的方式来形成产业资本崛起的。那我们进一步呢，应该说哈德森要求呢，是不是应该学习英国、德国和欧洲当年是如何富强的？ 所以呢，那就要从本质上去讨论价值、价格和租金理论，把重点放在交换和收入上，而不是把重点放在关注财富的增加上。他提出呢，在马克思资本论的第3卷里面，自由市场的经典理念是一个免于遭受租剥夺的市场，也就是说，不是讨论经济租的，人家讨论的是如何通过价值、价格来理解这个市场。所以他说呢，马克思资本论的第3卷不是关于地主、垄断者、债权人自由地为所欲为的这个市场经济。马克思在讲资本主义相对于封建主义是一种进步的时候，主要针对的就是封建主义的这种吃租经济。好了，当把这个道理讲清楚的时候呢，就知道了为什么工业化对于资本主义来说是一个让资本主义称之为历史进步的一个重要内涵，而不是传统的地主经济。而到金融资本阶段这尽管不是地主经济，但是靠吃租这一点却是金融资本阶段的一个很重要的特征。也就是说，金融资本呢，在这个新的阶段上并不意味着是进步。相对于产业资本来说呢，作为资本主义相对于封建主义的进步的内涵来说，那当资本主义进步到所谓的金融资本阶段的时候，也就毫无进步性可言了。